Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Ultimate General American Revolution. And in this particular video, I want to talk about difficulty scaling, sea invasions, and all the cheats that the AI is currently using in the game that cause problems for a campaign. The problems are both from a practical standpoint, how the game systems, which are fairly good, like the reputation system, the production system, etc., those can be fairly good, but the way difficulty is handled and the constant waves of enemies undermine those systems, and then issues from a historical standpoint because it's getting ridiculous. But before I get into the issues of American Revolution, let me talk a bit about the previous games that Game Labs has developed, specifically Gettysburg, Civil War, and Age of Sail. So in Gettysburg, on the difficulty, what would happen is you would have the Battle of Gettysburg with the same kind of dilemmas that Meade and Lee would have faced, historically speaking. And it might seem ridiculous for a game made in Unity engine by an indie team to be far more historically accurate than pretty much any other game that's come out since then or before, but it did succeed in having that intensity of combat, creating a satisfaction for it. Like, the first time I won the Battle of Gettysburg there as Confederate, it felt extremely satisfying. And then I played it again because I wanted to get a decisive victory. Not just a simple victory, but an absolutely decisive victory against the Army of the Potomac. That was the brilliance of Gettysburg. It was a kind of game where you would play it once, you might win, but then you ask yourself, okay, how can I do better? How can I improve? How can I get better results? Because it felt satisfying to do so. Without difficulty sliders, difficulty modifiers. Now, there was a difficulty modifier in the sense that you could choose different AI behaviors, which is certainly a better way to do difficulty than what a lot of other games have done before or since. But you didn't have like this idea, oh, the AI is just going to get more troops or more resources or just cheat. You could enable like a cheat mode, never bothered with it, because I felt the default game mode was so incredibly satisfying, and I felt like cheating would have undermined it. Problem is, the developers started enabling these modes more and more. So with Civil War, you still had the baseline campaign, which had this intense combat and dilemmas of the Civil War battles. Either you were playing as Lee or Grant. Sure, you could customize your general. I always went with Lee and Grant if I was playing a campaign there. I never understood this idea of general customization in the series anyway. What's the bloody point? Like, you should be playing Washington, right? British side, it's a bit weird, I guess. Who would you pick as the general in charge of the British forces? Maybe you rotate the generals, as it did happen historically. Just a perspective, I think the general customization, it just doesn't make sense. It never made sense in Civil War. It doesn't make sense here. It doesn't make sense in Age of Sail. My perspective. One of the smaller issues I have, because, yeah, you can still play Washington and you can still play, Cornwallis if you want to go with that. But regardless of that particular situation, with regards to the generals, Civil War was great. You had the intensity of the historical battles from Bull Run all the way to Cold Harbor. You had, and then going on to Richmond or going on to Washington. You did feel like you were either following the course of history or creating your own. And what was great about both Gettysburg and Civil War is you could literally read accounts of these battles, historical accounts, journals, what the generals fought, what their perspective was, and look at the strategies that were used, use those, learn from things that were handled wrongly, badly, and really improve your battle performance. Those were those kind of games. Like, you could use genuine historical tactics and strategies, maybe not necessarily fitting the period, but absolutely historical to win those battles. Like, one of the problems I had playing as the Confederates, and I'm sure a lot of people have had that play that, is like Hardin's Pike. So that's a nightmare of a mission. Like, there's two battles just before Washington, which is like an alternate history battle, like where you march on Washington to end the war as the Confederates, the final mission. But there's two minor battles, which are anything but minor, in the Confederate campaign, they're kind of annoying because you have to assault these incredibly fortified Union positions that are manned by tens of thousands of troops. They might even outnumber you, and you have to take those fortifications. So what do? Well, I struggled with that for quite a few campaigns, and for a long while. In fact, some campaigns I literally won with ignoring those battles because you can, and just going on to Washington directly. So what did I do? Well, I was looking at another video on this subject, and someone mentioned in the comments, oh, Napoleonic assault columns. Okay. I adapted my formation for that, launched mass melee assaults with columns, trying to replicate that. It worked. It worked brilliantly. Oh, sure, I still lost a significant number of troops against fortified positions, but I prevailed. I won those battles. That's the kind of series this has been, until Age of Sail. So Age of Sail takes the piss on historical accuracy in that respect. Battle accuracy, tactics, all that. The problem with Age of Sail, and this game, like Ultimate General American Revolution, really feels like it's built on Age of Sail. The problem with Age of Sail is that it's heavily based around the idea, like one of the problems that existed in the campaign still exists to this day, but you can turn it off, is the idea of adaptation. Basically, regardless of how well you're going to do, the enemy is just going to throw waves and waves and waves of forces against you. In Age of Sail, this would take the form of like, oh, you get the ship of the line. You had the particular campaign battle, like say the British campaign. You have one particular mission where you can capture a ship of the line. Congrats. The British, the French, Spanish, they're now going to have ships of the line in adaptation. It was this stupid idea that regardless of how well you did, or actually worse, if you were doing well, the game was always trying to present a level of challenge. I think that's a really dumb way of handling difficulty. If someone's playing the game well in a single player game, their reward is they dominate their opponent, not the idea that we're going to throw hordes of enemies against them, especially in a game like that. So it led to a real sense of frustration. And to this day, Age of Sail is a really frustrating game to play, and I can't take the Barbary campaign seriously in any way, because when you're dealing with the Barbary pirates who, for some mystical reason, have captured ships of the line and are using them against the Americans, that is absurd. That's the problem. You go from the historical accuracy of Gettysburg and Civil War to the mystical bullshit of Age of Sail, and then you have a game like American Revolution, which is built on the principles of Age of Sail. You might understand why it's a jarring experience for those of us who have played this series from the start. I understand that there's veteran players who do want the challenge. I get that. But I stress out, if your handling of difficulty is just throw more shit against the player, that's not going to make things challenging. It's going to create a situation similar to Total War, where there's a level of frustrating, grindy challenge early on in a campaign, and then you annihilate everything that stands in your path in the late game. The reason it happens in Total War is the same exact reason why it's happening here in this campaign. Because this campaign, by the end of August 1775, is won. I have killed more British soldiers in this campaign so far than were killed in the entirety of the American Revolution. That is not an exaggeration. By the end of this campaign, I will be exterminating the British en masse at the current rate of casualties. That is my problem with it. And it's not just like beyond the historical issue that causes, which I'll get into more detail, it's also a practical reason. So let me explain what the problem is from a practical game standpoint. So you have all of these systems, but the one I want to focus on is production management. So the guns, the ammo, the artillery, the ships you're using in a campaign are ones you can produce. Here's the problem with throwing hordes of soldiers at the player, because that's what the AI will do. They have these naval invasions where every month or so far, now the developers are changing it, but they seem to change it specifically dependent on the difficulty, but they still happen on every difficulty. Every month or so, maybe longer than that, and especially when the map hasn't expanded to Canada as it has here, because right now I'm I've conquered Quebec. I'm marching on the rest of Canada and Maine. Every month or so, you get about 2,000, 4,000 British soldiers marching on you. 4,000 lambs to the slaughter, as I'd call them. So far in this campaign, I'm getting very close to 30,000 British troops killed. And with naval component, well, I haven't really bothered with the naval aspect because I dislike it. Because I dislike Age of Sail. I've played Age of Sail multiple times, and I hated it every single time. It's grindy, it's annoying, because it's so focused on the idea of capturing ships and using it against enemy, you are forced to do it. And so you end up with these horrible bullshit battles. Like, the mechanics of battles are fine, but it's just like, oh, you have to, in order to win, you need to get bigger and bigger ships. Oh, how do you do that? Oh, you have to capture them. Well, great. Also, the bigger ships that you're fighting that you have to capture, the old Terra Party are smaller ships early on, so you end up with these really frustrating battles. Like, capturing a ship of the line in Age of Sail is an enormously frustrating experience to go through. That's the thing that really annoys me about Age of Sail as a campaign. So just something to point out over there. But let's talk about like the constant sea invasions, because like every month you're going to get about 4,000, maybe more, maybe less, but you're going to get thousands of troops invading you every month. That's among other events. Like, for instance, over here with Canada, you get the Canadians dealing with, like the British loyalists in Canada that you have to deal with. So more thousands of lambs to the slaughter. Here's the problem. A big portion of the game and its mechanics are balanced around the idea of setting up production lines, worrying about supply lines, worrying about ammunition, worrying about officers, building units. The reason throwing hordes of enemies against the player is not a great idea from a gameplay standpoint is because it completely makes everything pointless. Why bother with research? Like, it's not just a question of like production line, it's research. Like, okay, I do want to unlock the different unit types, want to get generals, but why bother getting any different types of cannons, rifles, unlocking those when the enemy is so generous? Like, I'll just give you an idea of what I'm talking about. This is 5 months in a campaign that's supposed to last close to a year and a half, basically. Like, to understand how ridiculous the situation is, I have captured thousands of brown besses to this point in the campaign. Artillery? Let's consider this. I have dozens of cannons. Do I need to produce any of those cannons? No. Why the hell would I waste my time? By the way, there's a bug here. I should deal with that. It does happen. That's just a bug. That's fine. Early access probably will be fixed at one point. But why bother producing cannons? Why bother producing ships? Why make the financial cost when I can just capture it from the enemy? Why spend the resources when I can be rich beyond measure by capturing it from the enemy? Like, that's the thing. That's the problem. Why give a shit? You don't have to give a shit. You set up you are aggressive very early game. You annihilate the British in Boston. And then once the enemy starts throwing hordes of troops against you in the meat grinder, you annihilate those too. And you captured their guns, you captured their ammo, you exchanged prisoners for resources. That's why it's dumb to think that difficulty in a game like this is good if you build it around the idea of throwing hordes of enemies on land and ships at the player. It will not. All it will do against any experienced player, it will fundamentally force them. It will force them down a campaign path where you realize as a player the best thing you can do is to just fight those hordes of enemies, destroy them, annihilate them, one at a time, capture their resources. Don't give a shit about your logistics, supply lines, any of that, because if you can capture all of that, the only thing you might care about is food, literally. I don't care about ammo, I don't care about cannons, I don't care about gun production. I have everything I need from the AI. And this was already an issue in Civil War. Let me be clear on this. Now, to some extent, it makes sense, right? You would capture armaments from the enemy when you defeated them, to be sure. But the problem is, the difference between Civil War and this, you just keep facing hordes and hordes of enemies that have no chance of winning. And it's this nonsensical bullshit idea that, oh, the player has to be challenged. It's not challenging. It's not challenging. It's quite exactly the opposite. You create a inverted difficulty curve where you have the hardest part of the campaign being the most difficult, and the middle game is a cakewalk. You could throw 100,000 men against me in this campaign, and I would find a way to defeat them. And I would emerge as the most powerful military in the world at this point. From a practical gameplay standpoint, when it doesn't work. So this needs to stop. It was stupid enough in Civil War. It's really ridiculous here. It is absolutely ridiculous. It's also ridiculous in Total War, before you ask about that. It is just as bad there. Like, I'm going to be facing the hordes of Britain over here. Now, from a historical standpoint, which shouldn't be ignored, historical standpoints do matter. How things stood historically is not something to just throw around. This is a game that's in a series that's trying to follow historical accuracy. Well, there's no fucking historical accuracy if you're throwing tens of thousands of British troops against the Americans to get slaughtered en masse, is there? Right? First off, there's the problem of the fact that historically speaking, the actual number of people that were killed in battles directly was low. Most people died from disease. Lots of troops were captured. To understand how many soldiers the British lost during the actual war, I think it's something around 20,000 killed, one way or another. Many more captured. So, context-wise, the British army, global scale-wise, the British on a global scale during this time period had about 200,000 men, or by the end of the war, had around 200,000 men, with about 50,000 or so in North America. Though, of course, those 200,000 have to account for mercenaries, militias, all that. The actual British army was no larger than 120,000, with 50,000 or so in America. Then you count the Germans and the loyalist militias. That's what you're talking about. 50,000 was the cap, if you will, of the British Army. And that's not including the Navy, the Royal Navy, which also was expanding. I think the Royal Navy manpower is something approaching 100,000. So 150,000 was the cap. You go to 100, if you account for the Germans, you're probably looking at 80,000. In this campaign so far, I've already killed 20,000 British regulars. I'm not counting the Canadian militia. I need to make that point. So around 8,000 possibly is the cap like the British have. I've already killed 20,000 regulars, and with the militia, with all the other over 20,000, more like 25,000, because like there were like, to give you the context there were like 8,000 troops in Boston. If I add everything up, closer to 12,000, then about 3,000 over here. Then about 3,000 over here in the Ticonderoga aspect. So we kind of start reaching, so like 8,000 in Boston, 3,000 for Ticonderoga, another 1,000 from other locations, you get to 12,000. Then I had 2 naval invasions, so yeah, 20,000. Then there was another naval invasion here in Falmouth, so 2,000 more, so 22,000 British regulars. And then, of course, we add other engagements that I had to deal with against the regulars and loyalists. So yeah, 30,000 in 5 months. By the end of 6 months of a war that lasted 8 years, I might add, by the end of 6 months, I will certainly have killed over 30,000 British regulars. That means I would have killed 60,000 British regulars within a year of the war. That's actually 6 times more than British casualties, or 3 times if we're counting for the men that died from disease and all that. So historically speaking, battles like Saratoga and Yorktown, that's why they were important. The British lost 7,000 men at Saratoga, 10,000 at Yorktown, between those captured, those killed, all that. So you're looking at 17,000 men, or 20,000 in total, men killed, captured, all that. And that's just those battles. Like, you're certainly looking at higher British casualties, but those 2 battles were decisive enough to win the war. Like Yorktown in particular. The British decided it was not worth doing that, because they honestly were paying an enormous cost for a war they couldn't win. truth be told, it was a fairly tall order for them to be able to win, as long as the colonists were hostile towards them. And they certainly were. And France did help, and so on and so forth, but unless the Continental Army collapsed because of the political affairs of the Continental Congress, which was a fairly big problem, unless the Continental Army collapsed, which it didn't, it was a very tall order for the British to be able to win the war, especially when the the Patriots showed that they were quite willing and capable of inflicting significant losses on their forces. That's the problem. 30,000 versus 20,000. By the end of 1 year, I'll be at 60,000. In 8 years, we're looking at 500,000. And that's on normal difficulty before you start exaggerating. This is not on the ultimate campaign difficulty. On ultimate, where the number of troops that you're facing is increased by like 50%, according to what it states. I haven't really tried to play it. But with 50% increase in numbers, you're probably looking at close to 1 million men. 1 million men at the end of the 18th century, before the Napoleonic Wars. Like hell, even with the Napoleonic Wars, you're looking at least half a decade of conflicts involving all the major European land powers to get anything approachable in terms of casualty numbers. Like at this point, like I should just rename George Washington the Archeon the Ever-Chosen and say that I will go exterminate the British armed forces in London. I will march on London and exterminate the British. That should be my campaign motto. Exterminate the British. Because 1 million men being destroyed at this current rate that I've achieved in this campaign, and you can be certain that that's what's going to happen here, is absurd. To understand the level of absurdity, do you know what the total manpower capability of the British at this point was? About 1.5 million. Why do I come up with that number? Really, 1.6 million. Why do I come up with that number? Pretty simple. Britain had a population of 6.5 million. If you deduct 50% because of women, you get 3.2, right? But then you have to cut it in 50% because you have the underage, you also have the elderly. That's something that kind of statistic is also applicable in a modern age. So if you want to understand, like say you're looking at the war in Ukraine and you want to understand what the total manpower that Russia or Ukraine has, that's the kind of calculation you have to make. In fact, I've actually looked at the statistics. They're pretty damn accurate. So if you want to understand the total available manpower of men of military age that are capable of fighting war, it's typically going to be about a quarter of the population. Britain mobilized a quarter of its male population during World War II. It's not easy. It's not easy. It is an enormous cost. It bankrupted them. It cost them their empire. Britain was not willing to lose its empire to fight the Americans. So, to point it out, so you get 3.2 million total male population, 1.6 million that are of military age that can fight. When you start talking of killing 1 million British troops to win the American Revolutionary War, based on what we're seeing, or 500,000 men to win this Revolutionary War, which would be a third of the total manpower that Britain had available, that's when you start calling it bullshit from a historical context. And it happens, and the reason you get those casualties is the game is designed this way. If there are no British troops on land, they're gonna get reinforced. So you're gonna get a naval invasion. It's triggered. There are slots for it, etc. But if you eliminate all the troops, for which you have every incentive from a gameplay standpoint to do, because you'll get guns, you'll get cannons that you'll use. You know what? At this point, one of the main limiting factors in my campaign beyond the officer shortage, one of the reasons that I don't have more artillery units in my guys is actually not because of I'm lacking the artillery pieces. Oh no, I have enough for all the slots I have. No, the main limiting factor is I'm not
capable of getting enough civilian muskets to equip all my guys. I can probably equip the vast majority of my forces over here with captured brown besses. That's the kind of situation that you have here. It's ridiculous, it's nonsensical, it's a bad design decision. And it's a bad balancing decision. I get it. Some people want to bash their heads against a brick wall. Do you really want to make the game for them? Or do you want to account for a game that has a better difficulty curve and is more historically accurate? Gettysburg and Civil War were more historically accurate than this. Age of Sail is not the model you should follow. I'm going to lay it down there. If the developers of Game Labs think Age of Sail was a great, superb game that you should build upon, I'm going to say it in the most blunt possible fashion. Age of Sail was a piece of shit. It was a piece of shit because of its difficulty balancing and because of the focus on capturing enemy ships, and there was never a reason to play in any other way. It's the best way to play it. It gives you the biggest advantage. It was practically necessary to do so. Now, sure, in Civil War, it was practically necessary in order to win a campaign, in order to try and capture as many troops as possible to cause them to flank, or to flank them. But that just meant using proper strategies in battles, whereas in Age of Sail, it was not about proper naval strategies. It was about boarding enemy ships in 18th century line warfare to capture enemy ships of the line. That's not how line warfare worked. That's not how naval warfare worked in the 18th and early 19th centuries, I have to say. Sure, ships were captured. Absolutely. Ships were captured, but not to this ridiculous extent. Not like this. Not how Age of Sail handled it, not how this game handles it now. They've taken that mentality, translated it on land, and caused the same problems on land, where you're focused on annihilating the forces because you capture guns when you annihilate the forces. And hell, once the prisoner of war exchanges are in, you'll have even more incentive to capture as many troops and annihilate them and obliterate them in a game. Like, if the hordes of hell are going to show up from Britain, bring it on. I'll do it. Like, literally, look at this campaign situation. Just to understand, I'm rolling in money. The reason I'm rolling in money is because I don't have to give a crap about production of anything. That's the thing. The biggest expense of my campaign so far has been intelligence. No joke, look at it. The spy network, because I was having intelligence at the highest level, the spy network was the thing. Everything else is fluff. Sure, I can get 100 rivals, I can produce carbines and all that, but it just feels meaningless in every way. Food is the only thing I really care about, food and supply lines. Ammo, I suppose. Not that I won't capture enough ammo. If the constant naval invasions stay in, and if the developers continue treating it as like the British as the Dyson sphere, or worse, if they turn around and when they introduce the British campaign decide to do it, oh, the Americans are just going to throw hundreds of thousands of men against you. That's just equally ridiculous. There were 2 million men in the colonies at this point, or over 2 million men. What? Are the Americans going to summon a quarter or half their population to fight the British when they struggle to put up more than like 50,000 men? Or more than 40,000 men, historically speaking? Yeah, let's go with that. That's why it becomes ridiculous. I do think that this is one of the areas they drastically need to change how they're handling difficulty. It is fine if a competent player annihilates the enemy. It is fine for you to drive the British out of Boston in 2 months. It is not fine when the reward for that is you get 4,000 British troops showing up every month. It breaks the game more so than any bug, any issue, anything else. It's not historically accurate because no commander will do that. Imagine if the British had lost within 5 months 30,000 troops. Imagine what would happen in Parliament, historically speaking, when they were playing in Parliament that were already dubious about the entire prospect of the war. Imagine if that had happened. And it only took 2 battles like Saratoga and Yorktown, 2 major disasters like Saratoga and Yorktown, for Parliament to basically give up on this conflict. And that was just like 17,000 men. I've won the war in 5 months. Consider that implication. And yes, it is fine
if I do achieve an early success against Bondsman, when the end result of it is like I become the blood god, that's not fine. Costin Saniat.